Salim woke up early every morning. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was his alarm. The sea was his life, and the fishing boat he owned was his main tool. He lived in a small, whitewashed cottage with a thatched roof, not far from the beach. It wasn't much, but it was home. Inside, it was warm, and the smell of fish drying on the racks would greet him when he entered after long days on the water. He had one daughter, Jenny. She was the light of his life. Since her mother passed away, it had just been the two of them, living in their little house. Salim worked hard to provide for her, but the long days at sea meant he didn't get to spend as much time with her as he would have liked. Still, whenever he was home, he made sure to spend time with Jenny. They would walk on the beach, or he would tell her stories of his fishing adventures. Jenny was a sweet girl, quiet and kind-hearted. She had her mother's eyes, large and brown, and a smile that could light up the darkest room. Despite the fact that she had lost her mother at such a young age, she rarely complained. Instead, she found joy in the small things, like helping her father clean the fish or gathering shells on the shore. Life was simple for Salim and Jenny, and although they didn't have much, they were happy. But deep down, Salim knew that Jenny needed more than he could provide. He worked hard, but sometimes the loneliness would settle in. He knew his daughter needed a mother. And perhaps, one day, he could find someone who could care for her as he did. Mr. Omar was their neighbor, an old man who lived alone in a small house with a tiny garden behind it. He kept chickens, vegetables, and herbs, and his garden was always full of color. The old man didn't have much, but he always had something to offer, whether it was fresh eggs, vegetables, or a warm smile. Whenever Salim went out to sea, Jenny would often visit Mr. Omar. She would help him gather eggs or water his plants. They would sit together on the small wooden bench in his garden, and Mr. Omar would tell her stories from his youth. Jenny loved these stories. Mr. Omar was gentle and kind, and Jenny could see the love he had for her. Even though they weren't family, he reminded her of her grandfather, even though she had never met him. Mr. Omar would often say, "You remind me of my daughter Jenny. She was kind like you, and you bring joy to this lonely old man." Though Salim was often busy with his work, he was glad that Jenny had Mr. Omar. He trusted the old man, and he knew that if Jenny ever needed someone, Mr. Omar would be there. Sometimes Mr. Omar would give Jenny fresh food, especially when Salim was gone. She was always so grateful for it. One day, Salim returned from his long fishing trip with exciting news. He had remarried. Halima, a widow with 2 daughters of her own, had moved to the village a few months earlier. Salim had known her for some time and felt that she would make a good wife for him. Her daughters, Sahar and Amina, were about Jenny's age. Salim was hopeful that his new family would bring happiness and unity to their lives. Halima was a beautiful woman with soft, flowing hair and a kind smile. She was pleasant to Salim, but there was a certain coldness to her when it came to Jenny. Jenny noticed right away that Halima seemed to favor her own daughters. At first, the differences were small. Halima would give extra portions of food to her own daughters and ask Jenny to help with more chores. But over time, it became more obvious. Jenny began to feel like an outsider in her own home. Sahar, the older of the two girls, was quiet and gentle. But Amina, her younger sister, was more outspoken and a bit mischievous. The two girls were used to being the center of attention in their home, and Jenny often felt invisible next to them. Despite her growing discomfort, Jenny tried to be kind. She helped with the chores as best she could, hoping that things would improve. But Halima's coldness remained, and Jenny began to feel a deep sense of loneliness again, even though she now had a new family. Salim's absence, due to his long days at sea, meant that Jenny had to bear the weight of the household chores. Halima, though not openly cruel, made sure Jenny did the bulk of the work. When Jenny finished her chores, she would find little food waiting for her. Halima and her daughters would sit at the dinner table, enjoying their meals, while Jenny was left with scraps. The strain began to show. Jenny, once full of energy and laughter, grew quieter and thinner. She missed her mother and longed for the days when she and her father would share the quiet evenings by the sea. The worst part was how Halima treated her. Jenny was never given the same care or attention as Sahar and Amina. One evening, after a long day of work, Jenny was so hungry she could barely focus. She wandered to the kitchen, but there was nothing left to eat. She felt tears well up in her eyes, but quickly wiped them away. She knew that if she cried, no one would care. Desperate, Jenny decided to visit Mr. Omar. He always made her feel welcome, and she knew he would have something to eat. She walked down the quiet street, past the cottages, and arrived at Mr. Omar's house. Mr. Omar greeted her with his usual warm smile. "Ah, Jenny, you've come just in time. I made a fresh stew tonight." Jenny sat down eagerly at his small table, and Mr. Omar served her a bowl of hearty vegetable stew. As she ate, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Mr. Omar had always treated her like his own granddaughter. He never made her feel like an outsider. "Don't worry, child," Mr. Omar said gently. "You are a good girl. One day, things will get better." Jenny nodded, though she wasn't sure if things would ever change. Jenny continued visiting Mr. Omar, and her mood improved slightly with each visit. She felt stronger and more hopeful, even though her life at home remained difficult. Sahar and Amina, who had noticed the change in Jenny, began to get curious. She was always smiling, even when things were hard. They wondered why Jenny seemed so happy while they had everything they needed. One evening, they decided to follow her. They waited until after dinner, when Jenny usually left the house. The two girls quietly trailed her down the street, staying out of sight. They watched as Jenny knocked on Mr. Omar's door, and he welcomed her inside. Sahar and Amina peered through the window, shocked to see Jenny sitting at the table, laughing and eating stew. The next morning, Sahar and Amina told their mother what they had seen. Halima was furious. How dare Mr. Omar give food to Jenny behind her back? How could he undermine her authority as Jenny's stepmother? That afternoon, Halima stormed over to Mr. Omar's house. She knocked loudly on his door, her face red with anger. "You have no right to feed my daughter. She is my responsibility, not yours," she shouted. Mr. Omar, startled by her sudden anger, tried to explain that he was only trying to help Jenny. "She is a good girl, Halima. She works hard, and I do not want to see her suffer." But Halima wouldn't listen. "You are interfering in my family's life. Stop giving my daughter food." Mr. Omar, deeply upset, reluctantly agreed to stop helping Jenny. "I cannot go against your wishes, Halima, but please be kind to the girl." Jenny, unaware of what had happened, went to Mr. Omar's house the next evening as usual. When she knocked, there was no answer. She waited, feeling confused, but eventually walked back home, a deep sense of dread settling in her stomach. Days passed, and Jenny grew thinner. The hunger she felt was more than physical. It was a deep ache in her heart, the feeling of being unloved and unwanted. Her stepmother, Halima, did not care about her well-being. When Salim was away at sea, Jenny spent her days doing chores and her nights in silence, unable to sleep from hunger. The other girls, Sahar and Amina, were always well-fed and comfortable, but Jenny felt as though she didn't belong. She missed Mr. Omar terribly. His kind smile and the way he made her feel safe and cared for had been the only comfort in her life. Without him, she felt completely alone. Each day, her body grew weaker. The energy she once had seemed to fade, and she no longer had the strength to work as hard as she had before. Her skin became pale, and the light that had always shone in her eyes started to dim. One evening, after a long, hard day, Jenny found herself sitting on the steps of their small cottage, her stomach empty. She watched the sun setting over the sea, but she didn't feel the joy it once brought her. She was cold, even though the weather was warm. She was lonely, though she was surrounded by people. And most of all, she was hungry. She thought of Mr. Omar again. She missed his kindness. She couldn't understand why her stepmother was so cruel to her. But she knew that Mr. Omar had been the only one who had ever treated her with the love she craved. That night, for the first time in days, Jenny decided to go to Mr. Omar's house, even though she feared he wouldn't be there. She walked down the quiet path, her heart heavy. As she approached his door, she saw a flicker of light from the window. She knocked softly, hoping he would answer. But there was no response. Jenny knocked again, a little louder this time. "Mr. Omar?" she called quietly. There was still no answer. She felt a knot form in her stomach. He couldn't have forgotten her. Feeling hopeless, Jenny slowly turned away from his door. She walked back home, her heart sinking with each step. She hadn't realized how much she depended on the old man for her comfort. Now that he was gone, she felt utterly lost. Now, from this point, the story will be continued in the next part.